DWO public meeting. The subject of today's meeting is Islamic State and Imperialism. The meeting will be in the format that I'm sure everyone is used to. There'll be a presentation on the issue and then time for some questions, comments and discussion. So just hand over to Nick for the presentation.
Thanks for the introduction. Today, wars are raging in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Nigeria, and I've probably left out a few more. I don't mention Palestine. And we're told that these are religious wars, and we're seeing an opening of a new period of religious wars, like the religious wars of the 16th and the 17th century. Is this in fact true? Are we seeing a new internationalism based on religion? We will argue that it's necessary to judge the movements which are leading these wars on the basis of what they actually do, not on the basis of what they think about themselves or what they proclaim to be. We'll argue that the forces fighting these wars are capitalist forces and the wars are imperialist wars. What they express is the bankruptcy of capitalism and the mayhem it is at present wreaking on the whole world. They also express the urgent need to replace capitalism as a social system of production and to replace it with communism. What I'm going to say will be divided into four sections. First, a brief look at the persistence of religion in today's world, then at the forces behind the rise of ISIS, and then looking at the class forces which ISIS represents, and finally a brief look at the way forward for the working class. So, to start with, the persistence of religion. Marx pronounced the criticism of religion as complete in the middle of the 19th century. Yet, today, 170 odd years later, at the beginning of the 21st century, we're holding a political meeting about the rise of religious forces threatening the balance of global imperialism. What is the reason for the persistence of religion? What is the theoretical reasons we can give for this? Religion, as Marx famously said, is the opium of the people, but in the same text he also characterized religion as the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the spirit of the spiritless situation. And he went on to point out that the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of people is required for their real happiness. But he also pointed out that the demand for people to give up the illusions about their condition is the demand to give up a condition which needs illusions. So it's a typical syllogism of Marx, putting everything in a very compact way, but also very true. But today, capitalism has produced a world of exploitation, oppression, and insecurity. It's certainly a world which still requires illusions and illusory happiness. Marx also points out in the first chapter of Capital that the religious world is only a reflection of the real world, and that this reflected world can only vanish when relations between human beings in their practical everyday life have assumed the aspect of perfectly intelligible and reasonable relations as between man and man and nature. Well, the social relations under capitalism produce exploitation, oppression, and war. In other words, they produce the soil from which religions spring. And this soil exists just as it existed before under slavery and under feudalism. And also the production relations between man and nature are difficult to understand. They're fundamentally antisocial. The exploitation under capitalism is concealed, and relationships are not readily intelligible. We should not therefore be surprised to find that religions have not disappeared under capitalism, despite the opposition to religion which appeared particularly in the French Revolution and the age of reason. Religions have certainly not disappeared, and in some cases they're strengthening themselves. All this is generally true, but there's definitely been a clear revival of religious ideology in the last 3 or 4 decades, which needs to be explained. We've seen the rise of evangelical Christianity, particularly in the US, Islam in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Hinduism in India, Judaism in Israel, etc. The reasons for this rise of religion must be located in the infrastructure of society and the operation of capitalism itself. We argue, as I think most people here would agree, that the general situation of the present period has been determined by the defeats of the revolutionary struggles which followed World War I. If these struggles had succeeded, we wouldn't be sitting here today talking about religious maniacs wanting to restore a medieval empire in the form of a caliphate. Religion would be a marginal issue on the path to extinction. However, capitalism did stabilize itself and has held unchallenged control of the world since 1921. In the period since, religious ideologies have persisted, at times becoming stronger, at times becoming weaker. Though there is obviously not a direct link between religious ideology and the capitalist economic infrastructure, we will argue that developments in the infrastructure condition and indirectly affect developments in the ideological superstructure of capitalism. A factor which affects this is the apparent stability of the whole capitalist system, which is dependent on the struggle of the working class against their position in the system. Looking at this in a bit more detail, we argue that the devaluation and destruction of capital in World War II brought in its wake a period of growth and reconstruction which lasted until the 70s. During this period there was almost full employment in the central capitalist countries and living standards rose. It was generally a secular period characterized by a decline in religious belief. The collapse of this reconstruction period led to a period of vigorous class struggle, which ended in the defeat of class struggles, restructuring and globalization of production. Capitalism, though successful in this battle with the working class, has since shown itself incapable of providing full employment in the central countries and incapable of integrating the dispossessed peasantry in the peripheral countries. This has led to billions of human beings stripped of their means of subsistence, eking out a precarious existence on the fringes of society and living on the edge of starvation. The World Bank, for example, admits that 1.3 billion people, i.e. 20% of the world population, now live on less than $1.20 a day and suffer malnutrition as a result. The expropriated and destitute are subject to famine, disease, and the ravages of war. At the same time, the capitalist system appears stable. We are told it's the only possible system, and the working class has not been able to put forward a vision of an alternative society. Its struggles against the system have generally been defeated. So, we thus have an impasse, a failing capitalist system, immersed in crisis with no apparent alternative. This is the material context in which the revival of religious illusions have taken place. They represent an attempt to find a refuge in the past. The second section I want to just go into is the creation of ISIS, which we argue, I think, not very controversially, I think it's generally accepted even in bourgeois analyses, that this is a creation of US imperialism. And it's an expression of capitalism's ideological bankruptcy. Capitalism necessarily leads to imperialism, and as the crisis of the early 70s intensified, imperialist struggles became more violent. In the Middle East, this led to greater domination of the area by the imperialist powers, who were determined to exploit and control its oil. This led to devastating wars between the clients of the main imperialist powers. The economic crisis and the more predatory interventions of the imperialist powers brought about a collapse of the secular ideology of Arab nationalism throughout the Middle East. At the same time, there was a rise in the ideology of political Islam. The first manifestation of this was the Iranian Revolution of '79, which brought about the overthrow of the US client regime of the Shah and the creation of the first Islamic regime. The rise of political Islam is therefore a product of the capitalist crisis. After the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in '79, the US decided it could use political movements of Islam for its own imperialist motives. What this meant in practice was to use the holy warriors, or the mujahideen, against Russian forces in Afghanistan. The US cooperated with the Pakistani military and the military intelligence to train and arm the holy warriors. And while the US's ally, Saudi Arabia, provided the ideology for this by setting up schools or madrasas and teaching the mujahideen the tenets of Wahhabi Islam. This operation produced the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and leaders such as Osama bin Laden. For US imperialism, it initially appeared to be a highly successful strategy. It led to the defeat of the Russians in Afghanistan, and the collapse of the Russian imperialist bloc followed shortly afterwards. However, the jihadis, which the US had spent so much money and energy training, did not simply disappear once the Afghan war was over in 1989, and subsequent developments turned them against their masters. The US occupation of bases in Saudi Arabia in the run-up to the first Iraq war, which was the war over the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, was seen by the Wahhabis as sacrilege. The infidels therefore needed to be expelled from the Holy Land. They used Afghanistan as their base, and with funding from Saudi Arabia started to operate against the US. They subsequently started to intervene in other conflicts, such as the Balkan Wars and the Chechnya Wars. And of course this was a pretext for further military intervention in the area. The attacks on New York Trade Center in 2001 was the trigger for a massive, renewed US military intervention in the Middle East. First we see the invasion of Afghanistan, supposedly to eliminate Al-Qaeda bases, but principally to gain access to the gas reserves of Turkmenistan. Then in 2003, the invasion of Iraq itself, with the aim of turning the country into a US oil protectorate. Clearly it was the US view that with Russian imperialist rival eliminated, it had a free hand to do whatever it liked in the Middle East. The proclamation of the New World Order and the end of history illustrates how US imperialism saw the new situation. This arrogance was certainly a factor behind the stunning incompetence with which these invasions were carried out. And the result certainly has been disaster for the US. In Afghanistan, it's ended up with an unwinnable guerrilla war in which its US principal ally, Pakistan, is clandestinely backing the Taliban forces opposed to the US, while in Iraq, the US invasion has ripped the country apart, produced a vicious sectarian war, and the country's collapse as a unified state. The collapse of the Iraqi state has opened a veritable Pandora's box, which has given rise to ISIS. US invasion destroyed the Iraqi state and the Iraqi army and brought the political forces of Shia Islam to power. These forces, of course, are allied to the US's principal enemy in the region, which is Iran. Initially, the battle against the US invader in Iraq was turned into a sectarian battle between Shia and Sunni branches of Islam, with the US assistance. And it needs to be remembered that before the invasion there was no sectarian fighting in Iraq, nor was there any Al-Qaeda faction in Iraq. The US invasion and the sectarian war they provoked now opened up space for the Sunni jihadis. ISIS started off as an organization fighting alongside other Sunni guerrillas in 2004. Initially, the group called itself Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but subsequently changed its name to the Islamic State of Iraq. It held bases in western Iraqi provinces, particularly Anbar, but was driven from these by the US troop surge in 2007. Many of the original leadership were then killed. In 2010, a new leadership of ex-Iraqi army officers, many of whom had been detained and tortured by the US, was installed. And in 2012, they reoccupied many of their bases in western Iraq. The start of the Syrian war in 2011 gave the group new opportunities, and they started infiltrating guerrillas into Syria, where they set up the Al-Nusra Front. This and the Iraqi organization were merged in 2013 to form the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham, or Levant, which is now known as ISIS. By the summer of 2014, last year, the group controlled about a quarter of Iraq and a third of Syria, and it proclaimed itself as a new caliphate, with its leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as the new caliph. ISIS initially received funding from the US allies, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar, and some from the US itself, because its operations were undermining the Syrian and Iraqi regimes, both of which were allies of their main enemy, Iran. ISIS was regarded as a pawn to be advanced as part of a larger strategy aimed at destroying the threat of Iran. However, the group's success in capturing territory, most notably oil wells and refinery, which have apparently given it an income of £3 million per day, all this, together with the capture of the Iraqi bank in Mosul, has given the group a war chest of approximately $2 billion, according to the New York Times. The inheritance of this loot has allowed it to break free from its sponsors. Even its ideological sponsor, Al-Qaeda, now disowns it. So, the group has set up state structures in the areas it controls. The civil servants who previously worked for Assad or the Baghdad regime now pledge loyalty to the black flag of the caliphate and continue to provide services and collect taxes. Trade and transports are taxed, and ISIS state extracts, refines and exports oil. This has made the group self-financing, and according to the New York Times, it pays its fighters $150 a day, which is quite a significant amount in the Middle East.
Significant amount in Durham.
Thus, ISIS is a product of US imperialism, but like the evil genie conjured up by the sorcerer's apprentice, it has escaped its creator. The US is now in the ridiculous position of fighting a war against this organization, an organization which it and its clients have actually created. In doing this, it's fighting alongside the Assad regime, which it had hitherto been trying to remove, and it's supporting its main enemy in the Middle East, Iran, a regime it would also like to remove. In the process, the US is actually supporting and arming Kurdish separatist organization, the PKK, to fight ISIS. Yet the PKK is still on the US list of terrorist organizations and an enemy of its ally Turkey. The US has actually been dropping arms to these people in the battle for Kobani. Elsewhere in the Middle East, in Yemen, all these alliances are just completely reversed. It's doing the complete opposite. So US position is now so contradictory that it verges on the embarrassing. This can only signify, as far as we can say, a sort of collapse of US hegemony in the Middle East. Thirdly, what forces does ISIS represent? What class forces? And some people are tempted to see in the declared caliphate something new. It appears to represent an extraterritorial movement, a movement which is not nationalist. Its fighters come from many nations and are recruited on the basis of religion only. And other groups of fighters in other countries, for example, Libya and Nigeria and Somalia, have also pledged allegiance to the caliphate. Does this make it an international movement, an internationalist movement? I think we have shown that ISIS is a product of imperialism. Its struggle is for the control of territory, particularly the struggle to gain control of oil and oil revenues. The state structure the organization has set up are not essentially different from the structures they replace. Production remains production by exploitation of wage labor, in other words, capitalist production. What ISIS does stand for is the installation of a new ruling elite, a religious ruling elite, such as existed in the medieval caliphates. This elite is to be the new controllers of the system. It is to replace the democratic, monarchical military elites, or even the Shia elites, which now control states in the Middle East. The caliphate aims to become an empire, as in medieval times, controlled from the center, but this time based on capitalism and exploitation of the working class. ISIS therefore fits easily into the architecture of 21st century imperialism. Its challenge to the dominant imperialist power, namely the US, results, of course, in the US trying to destroy it. ISIS, therefore, is another bourgeois force which has been produced by this decaying system. It's a minor force. It's not a serious threat to the balance of imperialist forces. And I think we're now seeing it being pushed back from a lot of its early gains. It is, however, a particularly vicious expression of the barbarity which exists in 21st century capitalism. Having said that, it must be recognized that ISIS is only a minor expression of this barbarity. This barbarity finds full expression in the actions of the major imperialist powers themselves. Although our rulers tend to be pretend to be scandalized by the crimes which ISIS commits, they don't bat an eyelid about the crimes they themselves commit. They're quite happy to murder hundreds of people at wedding parties with drone strikes, burn women and children to death with phosphorus shells and napalm bombs, to carry out the most depraved tortures in hellholes like Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo Bay, to carry out special rendition, to reduce cities to dust and create millions of refugees and all the rest. These things express the real nature of imperialism and the real nature of capitalism today. ISIS's internationalism is simply an attempt to build a new empire using Wahhabi Sunni Islam as the ideological glue to stick it together. No one should be deceived by it. It's the complete opposite of working class internationalism, which is based on international class solidarity and the struggle to replace capitalism with communism and to end class society. The present crisis requires an anti-capitalist class response. The social movements known as the Arab Spring, which erupted in late 2010, have all, with the exception of Tunisia, led to bloody repression or civil war. The Syrian civil war is the most brutal example of this. The demand scrawled on the wall by teenagers in the city of Daraa for the ending of the Ba'athist regime has led to the present catastrophe. In 4 years of war, according to the UN, 220,000 people have now been killed. 3 million refugees have fled the country and 6.5 million are internally displaced. Out of a Syrian population of 17.9 million, over half have been turned into refugees and over 1% have been killed. It illustrates how capitalism can offer today only exploitation, massacres of civilians and imperialist war. The problem is the capitalist system itself. As long as the system survives, we will have more Syrias, more Libyas, more Ukraines. Struggle against the barbaric effects of this system need to be directed at the system itself. They need to become class struggles with the aim of overthrowing the system. The Arab Spring was an interclass movement dominated by the middle classes. Although the entry of the working class into struggles in Egypt and Tunisia showed the importance of the working class in its ability to paralyze the system and force the regimes to retreat, this did not happen elsewhere. In addition, workers in these countries did not organize independently on a class basis or put forward their own class demands. The working class movement was subordinated to the people's movement, which put forward bourgeois, liberal demands. In Syria and other countries affected by the Arab Spring, the working class did not enter the struggle as an independent force. This has made it much easier for the bourgeoisie to regain control and convert the working class into cannon fodder for imperialist war. The alternative to imperialist war is, of course, class war. What this means is that the workers need to struggle for their own class interests and those of the international class brothers, regardless of the interests of the bourgeoisie, which are disguised as the interests of the nation or the interests of the people or the interests of religion. The only path for the proletariat of the Middle East is one that leads to unity and recognizes that capitalism is a single global system that needs to be overthrown globally. It doesn't matter whether workers are in the Ukraine, in Europe, the US, or in Syria under the black flag of the Caliph. We need to put forward a revolutionary alternative to this barbarism. We need to end the system of wage labour and all that springs from it. What is needed is the creation of an international political organisation of the working class, able to articulate a social alternative to capitalism and give the lead in turning class struggle into struggle for a communist world. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for that presentation. Now, we can sort of open things up for questions and contributions. Please sort of keep any contributions sort of succinct and sort of not more than 5 minutes max. And if you represent an organisation, you might want to say who you're representing.
I've just come in with a short thing. Phil from NDF. I suppose we sort of represent the NDF. Thanks for the presentation, nice and clear. Good framework for understanding events. I just wondered if you, how you saw the potential for escalation in the Middle East. I mean, I must admit I was a little bit concerned when the sort of events in Yemen opened up and everybody started getting involved with the talk of Israel and so forth. So, how you saw potential for more and more involvement either from Israel and America in the region. Because, as you say, the partnerships in different parts of the region are just mixing up so much. It just seems like a potential for getting out of hand. A bit broad, sorry.
I do think the US is in a sort of Alice in Wonderland position in the Middle East, and clearly it wants to try and disengage, but it's not really able to. I don't see a major escalation coming though, because the other imperialist powers, the real powers, not Al-Qaeda, are not absent, and they're not prepared to commit themselves. I mean, the Russians, I think, will carry on supporting Assad regime till the bitter end because of what happened in Libya, and because they have a military base in Tartus, I think it is, on the Mediterranean coast, and what I think with the future is going to be continuation, more of the same, really. I can't see anything more coming of it.
I think there's no way that this is going to back off. The process that we're seeing going on is one of increasing intensity of conflict. The US, the twin pillars of US foreign policy in the Middle East since 1945 have been Saudi Arabia and Israel. They're still in place. They haven't shifted from that. What's interesting about the Yemen thing, and it's a new departure, is that for the first time Saudi Arabia has put together the coalition. Previously the Americans put forward the coalition and the Saudis joined it. This one, although they did announce it in their Washington embassy, so it's not quite the independent emanation you think. But what is serious about the Yemen is it's bringing the wars closer to the Saudi mainland. And of course, some people think that Saudi Arabia, because it's an absolute monarchy and it's got a fantastic secret police and it locks everybody up if they just drive the car and they happen to be female, it's got complete control of its citizens, but it hasn't. There are millions living below the poverty line in Saudi Arabia. It's quite a dramatically class divided place, and a lot of them just happen. The bottom 15% just happen to be Shia. Right. So for Saudi, the question of religion and the interests of the monarchy, and you've got to remember that the Saudi monarchy is a theocracy. It would not stand for 1 minute in Saudi Arabia if it had not adopted Wahhabism in the 1930s. Well, it actually adopted Wahhabism in the 18th century, but it re-adopted it as their main ideology in the 1930s when the British were helping them get the whole of the Saudi peninsula. But they're extremely... if you ever go to the United Arab Emirates or places like that, the Saudis are everywhere. The places in the Gulf are scared to act without Saudi approval, and it's quite a dominant position they have. And of course we saw that in, was it 2013 or was it 2012? I'm getting too old to remember these things. But when the Saudi army just went straight across the causeway into Bahrain and crushed a popular revolt, but against the monarchy, which was a Sunni monarchy with links to the Saudis, and the Saudis have propped it up ever since and continued to supply it with arms and other means of oppression to keep down the Shia. So the situation is becoming more and more intense and desperate, and what we're seeing is that wars don't finish. The more they talk about peace processes, the more the number of wars that never actually have a final ending and just simmer on. Look, I mean, take the Congo. We're supposed to be a peace there, but people are getting massacred left, right, and centre. And it's the same again in the Middle East. And the cynicism of it is quite unbelievable. I mean, I don't know if anybody's been following what's been happening at Yarmouk, this so-called Palestinian refugee camp on the outskirts of Damascus. But before the Arab Spring, that was a massive suburb of Damascus with 180,000 Palestinians who are the original Palestinian emigrants from the first clearing out of Palestinians in 1947-48, and they were there right up to the beginning of this war. About 90% of them have left. And what's left is a group, mainly the people who are diehards, who have tended to support Hamas, and because there are PLO supporters in there as well, but because they tend to support Hamas, and Hamas has withdrawn its support from Syria, from Assad, Assad's quite happy to let ISIS come into this camp to do the massacring of his enemies, and this is and of course what he then does is he barrel bombs both sides, so it gets, it's a really cynical win-win situation, and they've been deliberately allowed to do this, to get so close. I mean, they keep talking about it's only 2 miles from Assad's palace, but this is something that they've actually deliberately designed to do, and actually trying to make sense of what's going on in the Middle East is like trying to knit fog. It is an absolute minefield of all kinds of intertwined alliances and all the rest of it. But the bottom line is, it is not going to get better, it's going to get worse. And the US, by sticking to its support for Saudi and Israel, but withdrawing from a lot of the other areas where it was dominant, is actually helping to stoke this up. And it's not necessarily against its interests to do it. Confusion is as good as sometimes an imperialist strategy as having clear goals. And in fact, increasingly, it is just making... It quite suits them that there's instability, because the more instability there is, the more the dollar becomes a treasured resource of the international economy. And keeping the dollar in as the main currency of the world trade and all world finance has been the US's aim right from the beginning. It was the reason why they took out Saddam Hussein, not because they had weapons of mass destruction, everybody knew he didn't have them, but because he had started to sell his oil in euros and other currencies, and undermining the dollar is more important to the strategy of the US than anything else. And so I think for the US, everything has been a win-win situation, despite the fact that it looks as though they're weaker and weaker. They're actually creating a situation where, in a more confused imperialist framework, their own institutions, like the dollar, remain at the centre of world trade and imperialism. Sorry, that was longer than intended.
I think it's a good point about the way that Shia-Sunni rivalries are being used by all the different powers, and I mean, I've wondered myself whether or not the part of the American aim in Iraq from the beginning was to, in bringing a democracy, bring Shia power base in Iraq in order to offset the Shia power base in Iran, and be able to sort of play them off between having a Shia base that would sort of be able to play that off against the Saudi Sunni power as well, and sort of realigning things to suit them in the Middle East. I mean, it's just a theory I haven't really looked into.
Well, the trouble was the Iraqi state was based on the Ba'athist party, which was predominantly Sunni.
Yeah.
It did have a lot of Shia at the top end, but it was predominantly rank and file Sunni. When the Americans came in, they just said, all of these are Saddam Hussein supporters, get rid of them. So they destroyed the state to start with. I mean, very effective revolutionaries there. Destroyed the state, but they didn't have anything to put in its place. And of course, the other thing that ISIS had put in, I think that's something we should have mentioned, that ISIS had put in play is the very fact that the notion that nation states are the natural integument of capitalism, right, is a very European one. And it doesn't work. And that's why they talk about the caliphate. They're going back to a cultural entity which actually transcended not just religious divisions, but also national and linguistic divisions. The caliphate, although many people think it's just all Arabs, but in the end, the caliphate ended up in Istanbul, right? The final caliphate, and the Wahhabis always regard this. Well, one of the problems for the Saudis is the restoration of the caliphate means that Saudi Arabia becomes another vassal state of the caliphate. So you can see why they, when the Saudi princes were backing IS, they didn't see the consequences of this, and now, of course, they are seeing the consequences. Especially now, once, as Nick said, the IS got independent means, but obviously, I think the fact that they can say we have a different concept, and this concept is uniquely in the Islamic world, and Islam and Arabism aren't the same thing, obviously, but the language of Islam is Arabic, and it's easy for them to pose as this. When Nick was tackling the question, are they internationalists? Well, in a way, this is their substitute. Arab nationalism was a total failure, but it never actually denounced Islam. In fact, I remember Nasser actually saying that Muhammad was the imam of socialism. So you do get people who believe that there is a kind of progressive integument inside Islam, especially those who focus on things like you've got to give away your money and all that kind of stuff.
So there was.
Sorry?
There was an element in Islam.
Yes, good point.
So I just wanted to make a kind of connected point, but slightly separate. That one of the points you talked about was a decline in sort of secular ideologies of Arab nationalism and so on. My sort of disagreement with that would be that there's no such thing as secular nationalism. Nationalism in itself is a religion and is one of the main false idols, false gods of our time, and that this links into the idea that you can have you can go beyond religion inside capitalism, which I disagree with. I think religion is alienation and is a form of alienation, but the capitalist alienation is the highest form of alienation, and its worldview is just as much a religion as any other religion. The fact that it calls itself secular and it believes itself to be rationalistic, etc., doesn't hide the fact that it is based on a religious outlook, based on the alienation, fetishization of commodities, etc. So things like the nation are a good example of this sort of. It's a religion. Nationalism, by definition, is a religious, in purely the negative sense, outlook in terms of believing in a false abstraction that doesn't really exist, and living with that as your moral sort of guidance and moral compass. It's the same. It's just as much a religion as sort of Islam is, you know. And I make that point partly because I'm working on an article at the moment about ISIS and Islam in terms of idolatry and its connection with alienation. So, for example, Eric Fromm makes a point that the thing that's being criticised in the concept of idolatry, in its original sort of form in the prophetic traditions, is a critique of alienation, is a critique of man-made things having power over humans, and that this idolatry is inherent in capitalism, and that it can only be overcome through a communist movement, and that is the basis of a critique of religion itself, is that it is still part of the same tradition of idolatry and alienation, whereas communism is a movement towards abolishing alienation and therefore idolatry in its traditional version of the idea. Anyway.
Something to think about. But I mean, we would say that the idea of nationalism is related to the interests of the bourgeoisie within a national state, isn't it? Because they saw the national state as the means in which they could develop their capitalist interests most efficiently.
But as an ideology,
Sorry,
as an ideology in terms of how it connects to people's ideas and
but
people's
it had a
motivations.
material basis, didn't it? Whereas religion hasn't got that material basis. Religion is I think as Marx said in the bit that I quoted, it's a result of inability to comprehend man's position and man's relationship to nature. Original religions saw gods in the sea and in the thunder and the rain and so forth. A multitude of gods which emanated in nature because they couldn't understand the relationship of man to nature, because of the sort of impenetrable nature of this. But obviously religion becomes a means of controlling people as soon as class society develops. And although the bourgeoisie criticised religion in the 18th century through the Age of Reason, religion's been profoundly useful to bourgeois society ever since. It provides mystification which justifies the exploitation and gives hope of a better world somewhere else. So you put up with this world.
Pie in the sky when you die, as Joe Hill said.
Pie in the sky when you die.
But then today, when we don't have in England, say, the same amount of people following religion, we still have just as much fundamentally alienated and religious worldviews. Whether or not that hope for to put up with exploitation is a flat screen TV or whether it's heaven doesn't make any difference. It's still a religion. It's still a religion of individualism, liberalism, democracy, consumerism. They're all religions. They're all ways of making people put up with their life. So they're all the negative aspects of religion, but they don't have the authentic human element which all the main religions actually do have at their core. So, especially at their source, the original movements that gave birth to the religions were all real human expressions, unlike consumerism, for example. And even, I would say, more so than democracy. I think democracy has always been a tool for tricking people, and democracy, even from its Greek inception up to now, it's always been the real democracy was in hunter-gatherer societies, tribal societies, where it was a direct control of daily life, and decisions were made communally. That they invented democracy. The Greeks made the religion of democracy, anyway.
I think the comrade over here is sort of playing with semantics, really, because basically what you're saying is that every ideological tool that the bourgeoisie use to mystify the working class is a religion, and it's meaningless. I don't really think there's sort of much mileage in this discussion. I don't think it's particularly helpful to sort of analyse the sort of the way that sort of capitalist ideology operates, and or how the sort of working class can emancipate itself. But you wanted to make a point, and then.
It's a difficult discussion. I think it is important to understand what it is that attracts disaffected young people to the ideology of ISIS and similar types of ideology. And it's
$150 a day.
Well, $150 a day helps. But
I'm not going to get that on my head.
I think there's more to it than that. When the young people are attracted to so-called radical Islam, the official bourgeois response is, we have to de-radicalise them. And the Muslims have to express, the moderate Muslims need to stand up and argue that, Islam is a religion of peace and so on. And obviously, this kind of ideology is not really working with the young people. And one of the reasons why it doesn't work is that in one or two small senses, what the fundamentalist Islam is expressing is the original revolt of what that Islam meant in the society that it arose. It's completely distorted and degenerated. But Islam, similar to Judaism, similar to Christianity, begin as movements of revolt of the oppressed. Different class forces involved and so on, but that's essentially what they were. And that's what contained their moral force. They were posed against existing civilization. And that's what is being sold as well to the young people, that we're completely opposed to this horrible decadent civilization. It's not difficult to show why it's a horrible decadent civilization. It's either, if you like, a false money, whatever it is, pornography, whatever the things that most upset people. So to prove that this system, whole civilization is completely rotten and corrupt, and that we should reject it. This is what attracts people, to young people. They're not attracted to the idea that they could live happily and peacefully within this civilization, because at some level they are completely rejecting it. But of course they're rejecting it in a way which is utterly negative and destructive, and is entirely caught up in reality with the imperialist massacres that are going on in the world, so that they immediately become embroiled in those massacres and take on the whole ideology of imperialism and so on that goes with it. But I think that unless we understand that ideological appeal of these movements, it's very hard to argue against them. There is, we have to be able to criticise both the jihadis' arguments and the arguments of those who say that you should adapt to the existing society. The jihadi argument is clearly a completely false revolt. It's not really a revolt at all. It's not really radical. So we should reject the whole idea that it's that these young people are being radicalised. They're not being radicalised, but they're being allured into a false conception of revolt. I think that the thing about the nation state is connected to that as well. That there is a sort of gut reaction of the idea that you should be loyal to this or that country, and this does express, certainly at the ideological level, the breakdown of traditional nationalist ideology. But in parts of the world, it actually expresses the actual material breakdown of nation states. Nation states which were set up on a very fragile basis by imperialism in the first place, like Iraq and Syria. They're all just lines drawn in the sand by the imperialist powers. They don't really have a fundamental solidity, and now they're cracking up because of the pressures of the world crisis, the chaos of the world system. So that there's a much greater possibility of movements which are no longer framed in the old national context. And I think what they express is the inability of capitalism in these areas to ever stabilise. Because the nation state was a form of stable capital rule. And now we're seeing the breakdown of these forms of capitalist organisation, but they're not going to be created. They're not going to be replaced by a realignment, by a real caliphate. The caliphate is going to blow up in all sorts of different directions and so on. So they are all expressions of the breakdown of capitalist system. What the introduction talked about, the impasse of the capitalist system. We might have disagreements about what causes that impasse, but certainly there is an impasse which offers absolutely no future. Well, maybe I'll come back later on whether the Americans benefit from all this. That's another question, I think.
Yeah, way I've sort of understood or can understand the attraction of the youth to ISIS and jihadis and so forth is sort of remembering back to my days at 17 and 18 and so forth, where living in... yes, I was that young. I can just about remember that I was there. But that sort of period, it was when all the leftist movements were really in full thread, all the student movements and so forth. I wasn't really in the middle of that. I was fairly sort of straight young man at that point in time, but we still had angry poster brigades, and angry brigade posters, sort of getting it right around, the red fist up on the wall. We all still felt that the angry brigade or Bader Meinhof, yeah, great, they're against the system, wonderful. You just don't object to that. You've just got something that you're against, and you've got this sort of elemental support for anything that's there that appears to be against it. And it seems to me much like that. This sort of problematic relationship with the West just draws them in. On top of that, I think the nature of Islam is in the way it seeks social control. It really cuts out the political. It is political. It doesn't have a left wing and a right wing as such, but there are different elements, different groups within Islam that perform that same role and take on political functions. It is not merely religious, in the sense that we talk about how you believe in God. Islam as a religion aims to take over the state and aims to impose social control on the people within it, and aims to manage what they do on a day-to-day basis or hour-to-hour basis and so forth. So it's very much sort of rooted in a feudal system of control where your status in society is legally codified and so forth. So it seems to me that you're drawn into the different... Once you're a Muslim, you're drawn into this sort of political debate between different elements of the Islamic Church. With the issue of the nation state, I mean, I've got a certain sympathy with what you're saying about all of these things in capitalism being religious in nature. I don't agree with you. I think, yes, you get into the terms that I would always talk about them being ideological, and I would call religion ideological. But I can see the common ground, because there is no reality to these things. They are man-made constructs, as you say. The nation-state was a construct to enable the economy to develop, but nationalism comes in later on top of that. It's a means of social control, and all these other things that you were mentioning are the same, including nationalism. It's a means, including religion. They're both means, ultimately, particularly in decadence, of social control. So I can understand the common ground, but I very much put it the other way around and say they are all ideological tools used by the system, including religion. Even if religion itself has a history that predates capitalism and had different functions at different points in time, it's been taken over by capitalism and used as a means of ideological control of the population. So I'll put it that way around.
I think the rational kernel of what you're saying, I agreed with everything Alf said and much of what Phil said, but the rational kernel of what you're saying is that nationalism is in itself, there's nothing natural about it. It is an artificial emanation, and I think that's quite acceptable. I mean, if you think about it, there were states on national territories long before there was nationalism. And under feudalism, we were all subjects of a monarch. In fact, we still are in this bloody country. But everybody in Europe was a subject of a monarch. They didn't have any national identity. In fact, they had a local identity. In fact, the Italians haven't got over it yet. They still have got local identities. You know, they don't even know who's in the next town. But then along comes the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie create the notion of the nation, the people, and that we're all equal, except some are more equal than others because they've got more money. But now we're all equal citizens before the law, whereas under feudalism you were in estates and all the rest of it. So the bourgeoisie have a natural need to inspire nationalism, to inspire us to go and die and fight for a country which we don't own, but they do in all the wars of imperialism that exist. So I think that is, but that's slightly different from IS. Right? IS, I think, are the product of a failed nationalism, the product of the failed Arab nationalism of the Nasserites, the Ba'athists, and all the rest of it over centuries. But the other thing about the IS is they don't offer it. You know, like feudalism offered a certain mode of production that you could understand. Capitalism comes along and offers a similar thing. What does IS offer? It offers, as Conrad said in the introduction, it offers exactly the same as you had before, except that it's like McDonald's. It's a franchise system, right? You local tribes can run your own local towns, provided you pay up, provided you don't transcend the Sharia or the things that we're sending. And if you do fall out of line, we'll be back with our boys and we'll behead 500 of your male people, exactly, which is in the Wahhabi code of how to deal with transgressors, and that's how they run the system. The Taliban had the same system in Afghanistan. They don't actually run the territories. They leave the traditional people in charge, the tribal leaders or whatever. But you buy into the franchise. You do what we say, and you'll be all right. You don't do what we say, we'll be back. It's a form of, well, I mean, actually, early modes of production often acted like that, paying tribute to the empire in ancient mode of production. It's a bit like that. Sorry?
Oriental despotism, anyone?
Well, if you want to throw... Well, Oriental despotism I wasn't counting, because I was thinking more like the Mongols, you know, who have a tribute system, and you pay, and if you don't, you get the fate of Bukhara or whatever. Whereas Oriental despotism arises through a common need of people to come together to actually be able to survive in a particular territory, so that you get an overarching state created out of more or less a different form of organisation, like almost like primitive communism, in each village uniting to create huge infrastructure to enable them to exist, or sometimes even well, you're the expert on it all, but to create people who are above the wall and to build monuments to the whole society and give their labour in that way. I don't mind calling it Orientalist, or whatever you want to call it. But anyway, that was the point. The point I was making was about how the Taliban operate, and it's sorry, not the Taliban. It fits how IS operates, and it's not it doesn't have anything new, and that's why I think it also is inherently unstable, because if you are offering to accept the overlordship of this group today, you can accept the overlordship of another group tomorrow. And of course, the big failing in Iraq was the Americans just handed it over to al-Maliki and the Shia. And the Shia militia now are the biggest menace to any kind of process whereby they can actually reconstitute the Iraqi state, even if they defeat IS, which I think looks likely.
The Shia militia are as bad as IS.
I was just going to say about the economy in the Islamic State. Apparently, the civil servants who still run the life of the Islamic State, they're still paid by the central government in Damascus and Baghdad. So Baghdad will pay the civil servants salaries. They'll drive through the front line from Islamic State territory to Baghdad, get their paycheck, and then they'll drive back. And the Islamic State will take like 50% as a tax. And you can set up deals with the Damascus government about oil, where they will Damascus will send the civil engineers to run the factories, and Islamic State will take a cut of the gas, and the Damascus government will get the electricity and then send parts of that back to Islamic State. So without the and of course, they're still using Syrian pounds and Iraqi dinars, so they don't have an independent currency either. So, especially what the economy is operating on is essentially basically banditry. And about the link between Islam and Arab nationalism, I was reading about this. This goes back to when Syrian state nationalised the schools in after '67. They made Islam because to talk about religion would have been to expose divisions within the Arab nation. So Islam was totalised as simply Syrian Orthodoxy. There was no discussion of Shia or Christian or even Alawite religions within the schooling system. So when the Alawites took power in the security services, I mean, even in Syria today, they're not taught about the Alawite religion. It's simply a communal identity. They might go to the shrines, but they don't know the religious beliefs of the Alawite community. So, this was an interesting background.
Just to come back to Conrad's criticism or reply to me, I wouldn't disagree with anything that any of you said. I disagree with the emphasis and the underlying idea of that there is such a thing as capitalist secularism, if you like the word. Secularism itself, to me, is an alienated and a fundamentally ideological point of view, and in that sense I would say it's religious. Obviously we get into semantics with that term because religion has, we tend to think of it as the religions, but personally I think that the aspects of religion which are sort of human creations and are universal to human society, whether it's class society or it's a non-class society, whether it's got a state or not, doesn't have a state. There are religious, or if you like, spiritual traditions that go all the way back to the beginnings of humanity, and therefore tell us something about humanity itself, no matter what society we're talking about. Religion, as far as I'm concerned, is a product of civilization, and religion, to me, is the process whereby those human creations become ideologies and become enforced as forms of state of social control, like you say. So, in that sense, I would stand by my point that nationalism, by its nature, is religious in the sense that it, in those senses. I would also, well, actually, I'll finish that, I think.
Just want to pick up on a couple of points on why young people are attracted to this, to radical Islam. Islam does believe in something called the Ummah, which is the community, which is obviously something completely lacking in capitalism. It is sort of supposed to be a community, and you're supposed to give a certain amount to the poor every time. And although it's sort of complete medieval system, the actual state of capitalism today makes many young people think, well, even that would be better than what exists today. And like the people who carried out these massacres at Charlie Hebdo were, as I tried to say, that they're living on the fringes of society. They can't be integrated into capitalism. Long-term, unemployed, rejected by society. And one of the things which seems to have radicalized them more than any preaching or anything is the US invasion of Iraq and all this stuff which has been broadcast about the atrocities and the tortures committed by the US and mass killing of people. That has radicalized them, making think anything's better than the present system. But what's happening now, which probably I didn't emphasize enough, is the actual divisive nature of what's going on. That these people are attacking the Shia, who are co-religionists with some sort of difference which no one can bloody understand anyway. I mean, there's...
It's to do with the succession of Muhammad.
Why kill each other? But then they're attacking Christians as well, and Yazidis and so on. They're producing massive divisions now, which, the question which might be worth bringing the discussion back to is how do we move forward from this? These people are, this whole thing in driving all these Yazidis up the mountain and beheading people in mass graves because they're Christians and just creating terror and further divisions. How is, we've had some comrades we've got comrades in Turkey, and the whole question of using the Kobani as a sort of rallying cry for the left, which is completely, we've exposed the falseness of that. It would be interesting to hear what comrades think, how we can sort of get out of this mess which seems to be getting worse and worse.
So, and I think sort of linked to that is the issue that the sort of bourgeoisie here are sort of getting hysterical about, the sort of British jihadis, the radicalisation of Muslim youth. I think it is a sort of radicalisation. The term radical doesn't necessarily have to mean progressive. Is there any, contribution we can sort of make to that? have we got anything to say to the Muslim youth who are attracted towards IS, or are they sort of so far beyond the sort of pale that they're not going to be open to the sort of Marxist sort of revolutionary ideas.
Well, one point I wanted to make about the what you were saying about the Shia-Sunni divides and the sort of killing of people for minor religious differences. That is part of the spread of Wahhabism, and that has been massively funded by Saudi Arabia over the last sort of 30 or so years. I mean, lots of different religious, lots of different Muslim people I've spoken to have said the same thing. That these schools all around the world have been never used to be there. It's all been pushed in the last 30 or so years that this kind of Islam. And
watch Bangladesh for the next one.
Yeah.
My madrasa watch is on.
And yes, and it's called takfiri, this idea that anyone does anything you disagree with, you can say they're not Muslim, and then you're allowed to kill them, basically. Which is connected, is part of the Wahhabi worldview. Also, in terms of sort of young Muslim people being sort of drawn to these ideas, I don't think you can say they're beyond the pale. Most of them, a lot of the time, they're not even that religious. The ones who get drawn into it, they're sort of converts. They're people who haven't really taken religion seriously, and then all of a sudden, they sort of get drawn into this ideology. So it's not a case of these sort of people being so religious that they're not willing to listen to other points of view. It's that these are the points of view that get to them and speak to them because, well, for one thing, you don't have to change your way of thinking that much because it's still a capitalist ideology. It's still, you go there, you fight for this particular group and its interests. You don't have to think about society and society's structure and so on. So, in that sense, the ISIS ideology is quite a straightforward, ideology to take on. It's also connected to the sort of growth in the ideas of the Illuminati and all these sort of end of world ideas, which are massively prevalent for good reason. So that's also a sort of connecting point where that's another point of why do so many people go to an Illuminati sort of worldview rather than a Marxist worldview. It's just a question.
Straight away. Oh gosh. Right. This thing about how can Islam, which is apparently so barbaric, how can that keep drawing young people in? I think is a confusing one, and sometimes it's worrying. Very worrying, just because of the level of barbarity there. But I think thinking realistically, thinking seriously, then there's plenty of evidence of class struggle and so forth in the Arab world over periods. Just because that might be at a bit of a low, fine, but even the Arab Spring was a rejection of a sort of core system. So it's not that Islam is capable of preventing revolt against itself. It's just that it doesn't seem to contain easy. It contains these splits between different factions and different whatever, but it doesn't contain a sort of a field where revolt, where an objection to the system is allowed. It just draws you into this conflict between, as I say, the various groups within Islam, as though they were left and right, but they're not actually left and right. In the end, I think you can say the same about the West. You look at the West now, and nationalism has a very strong hold on people. Nationalism and money and so forth. So it's exactly the same problem. We look at Britain, and you say, well, how on earth can we see a revolution to break out of this mould? And it's very hard to see it. So I think this thing of can Arab youth, can Muslim youth actually revolt against Islam is a bit of a false question. It's false. It's the same problem we're having, it's just slightly different problems. I do think there's more of a discussion to be had about what happens in face of a revelation, because I don't think Islam is just like any other religion. It's not like in a situation of a working class revolution, the Church of England is going to be sitting back and not doing very much at all. But Islam won't. Islam will have a violent reaction. Islam will split, and yes, there might be a working class revolution, but the steadfast Islamic Church will be fighting that, will be out on the streets and reacting very violently to that, because what I said before, it really does depend on or aim to take a strong social control over the way its elements behave. And it will not accept the mosque being taken over, expropriated, and it will not accept us stopping organised religion is probably all into an organised religion.
Take your points about the probably about the C of E, but I guess some of these kind of sort of evangelical churches in say in America would be exactly the same.
Yes, I agree.
John.
Nick's asked the question of what can we do? What contribution we could make? Well, from here and now, it doesn't look very promising. And in fact, to link it to what I think has been a coherent explanation of why the young people have been taken in by IS and that kind of radical Islamist ideology. I can't remember the year it was, we went to a concert in Bradford.
I went to see Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan.
That's right.
St George's Hall, Bradford, and there was a group of guys outside, weren't there?
Yeah.
With their materials.
And these were the first Islamic fundamentalists we'd ever met. They looked to me like school kids at the time, but I was getting on a bit. I can't remember what year it was, but it was after the fall of the Soviet Union. I know that because we said this is rubbish, and he said, well, what are you? And we said, we're communists. And he said, oh, that failed with Russia, didn't it? And there were Pakistani lads talking in broad Yorkshire accents. It was a laugh to behold. But that throws the question back, doesn't it? It throws the question: is it here in the heartlands of capitalism, we have not recovered from the ideological identification of Stalinism with communism and its subsequent demise. And as long as we have that necklace around our neck, we are weak here. And because we are weak here, we are in no position to help or do anything to assist workers in any of these places. But the only thing we can do is get our own houses sorted out and build what we can as best we can by finding ways and means to overcome the ideological retreat that we've been facing, and also to unite all the people that we can into a political movement. Because once you've got forward traction, then success breeds success, and failure breeds failure. And so unless we can take advantage of the current crisis and the fact that 1 million people a week are using food banks and all the rest of it, unless we can make something in this and make something of it, then we can't make a contribution to anything anywhere else. Or no, I'll make the next point later.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'll make two fairly brief points. The first one is, what is our contribution? And I thought it was very appropriate that in some ways, the response to the question was to go on trying to understand the question why are young people attracted to radical Islam. Our contribution is first of all one of our fundamental contributions is first of all to try and understand, to analyse the situation from the point of view of the working class, and that we and that so that our contribution is our analysis. The contribution will be the contents of the presentation on the website, articles. We shouldn't undermine that. And obviously, yes, we discuss the points of view of certainly we discuss with people who have all sorts of ideological mystifications, whether it's radical Islam or leftism or any other or any other mystification if they're willing to discuss. On the question of what will be how would Islam, how would the revolution have to deal with Islam? But Phil's question, that we could expect a very violent reaction from Islam, and contrasting that with the Church of England. I think that one thing we should be aware of is thinking that the elements of the British democratic state are some kind of pushover. The Church of England is part of the British state. Jock reminded us that we've got that it has a monarch in touch with the British state. It's got Parliament, and it's got a very strong democratic ideology, none of which stops the state being every bit as brutal and violent as imperialism is, as set out in the presentation. So we should not think that what the working class will meet in will be in sort of Western democratic countries when will be any less violent or determined or dangerous. It might just be a lot more clever and a lot less. And so we shouldn't ever forget that.
I just wanted, 2 points. One to pick up on something that Phil said. It may have been a slip of the tongue. You said we're going to stop. We're going to stop the mosques or stop religion, or I think
organised religion.
I think
I said organised religion brought into that, didn't I?
Well, it wasn't clear. It wasn't clear to me.
Yes.
Obviously, I mean, if you look at the policy of the Bolsheviks before Stalinism, it was not to suppress religion. They realised that it was a futile thing to try to suppress the churches. You could prevent them from, obviously, their wealth could be taken away from them.
Yeah.
Well,
That's one thing.
Yeah, okay.
But to prevent people from going to church, expressing their religious ideas, was a mistake. It would only reinforce religious convictions. So that you have to then win over people, and however crude the Bolshevik campaigns against religion may have been, it was motivated by the idea that you had to win people over. You had to win people over to the idea of communism, and that people will come towards communism. Still with many confused ideas in their heads, but they were prepared to support the Soviets because they weren't going to take up arms against the Soviets, even if they still had all sorts of ideas in their head. So I think we have to be clear on that. We are going to win. We are going to convince people. We have to remember those traditions in the workers' movement, because the anarchists don't understand that. For example, the anarchists in Spain, they say, well, let's burn all the churches.
All the petrol they wasted.
And
no, I didn't mean all
Quite impressive
religion,
buildings
but
as
yes,
well.
this ideology can be
taking over the church.
quite dangerous, really.
Okay.
The other thing was about, I agree obviously with what Helen just said about the contribution we make at the moment is largely a theoretical one. But I think that we have to also look at the state of the existing tiny revolutionary or proletarian movement, and in the case of the situation, the concrete situation we're talking about with Kobani and ISIS and so on, we can see that this has caused deep problems amongst those people who one might have thought would be on the sort of at least vaguely in the internationalist terrain. There's been a real tendency for a whole part of this, certainly the anarchists, the libertarian milieu, to rush to a sort of classic anti-fascist position that they took up in the 30s, and to revive all those arguments that you've got to defend Kobani, even if it means supporting people you don't like that much, like the PKK. And that is a really important demonstration of the difficulties of developing a real internationalist movement today. Because as soon as you're really put to the test on something which, a gut question, people are being murdered, massacred, surely you've got to do something. The difficulty about establishing a really solid internationalist resistance to that is brought to the fore. And it's because the anarchism doesn't, in many ways there are weaknesses of that. Although there are anarchists who are opposing this and are taking an internationalist stand quite clearly, they don't have the same underlying theoretical or programmatic solidity to be able to really defend these positions. So that obviously the communist left is vital for the maintenance among a wider proletarian minority, if you like, for maintaining internationalist view. But then that's another discussion. Of course, the communist left itself is not in a very healthy state. It's disunited. It's unable to unite its forces, and we can go into that if you want. If you don't want to, we won't. But I think that it's very important to understand the weakness of the situation that we're in. And it's okay to talk about building an internationalist movement, but we also have to understand the profound weaknesses and in fact crisis that we ourselves are in.
The discussion's moved on since I was going to add just something about on the religious question. Marx has a wonderful passage in the introduction to Capital Volume 1 where he said the Church of England would rather lose all 39 of its articles than one article of its property, which when Alf was talking about what we would do with organised religion. And then after that, I think religion's like smoking. We just tell people it's unhealthy. And then gradually the message gets through that, okay, you don't bother with it. But certainly repression will only create martyrs. I mean, martyrdom is the essence of religion, although you're more expert on that. But I would think that would be just what they wanted, so I absolutely agree with Half on that. And when he was thinking about Kobani, in the northeast we get out and about around our local anarchists quite a bit, and the big fight with them, they're all in the northeast anti-fascist, whatever it is, and they are farcical. They go to a demonstration against the EDL. The police managed to keep us apart, and a good job, because otherwise we'd get a hiding, right? And then they go by it and write, we stopped the fascists. And it was the democratic state stopped the fascists, and the democratic state saved me. And I've written this to them, and they don't get it at all. They live in this fantasy world, and the same people I polemicised with. That's why I wrote the article on Graeber and on Kobani. I was going like, steam was coming out of my ears when I read it. I think this is it is a really. The anarchists never get it, do they? I mean, you can tell them time and time again. Remember when you were anti-fascist the last time? What happened to you from the Stalinists? And they don't ever draw the lesson that it was a way for them to be drawn into an imperialist conflict and get massacred. And they've never got it. And it's the same in the Ukraine. In the Ukraine, you'd need a Diogenes lamp to find somebody who's come out with an internationalist statement. I think there's only the Kras from Russia, isn't it, that have actually come out with something that is. I mean, it's not. We might even quibble with the odd wording of it, but it's certainly the clearest indication of some internationalist perspective. For the rest, you've got who's the fascists? They're all fascists. There isn't a single progressive or force that's on the side of the working class in the Ukraine. And this is again another function of, there's cultural factors at work here. I mean, when we were talking to those daft people from Moscow, they could not see ever. They denied they were nationalists all the way to the end. They couldn't see that all this cultural identity with the Russian state was somehow a transgression of proletarian principles. They never got it. And in fact, we've heard from people in Ukraine who say that it's the same with Ukrainian groups there, including anarchists. They all got their myths of the past that they keep on churning and churning out, and they're all positively dangerous for the working class. And this is the situation. And I would agree that what we need to do is to improve our own act, because the only thing we can do is to increase the analyses, increase the number of places we try to get these analyses to, because there's no point making them in, as Damen used to say, a typewriter is not a very revolutionary weapon unless what you're typing gets out to the people that you wanted to reach. And I think we've also got a problem with the concept of the communist left, because I see people all over the bloody Facebook saying that the communist left, and they haven't a clue what the communist left is. And they just, they have never. I think some of them think that Stalinism is communist left. I'm not sure. I can't quite work out where they're coming from. But certainly, a definition, a sharper definition of what is class politics is still, after all these years, is still needed. I mean, although I do keep pointing out to younger people, if our generation hadn't, against all the odds, kept on fighting for that position, then there'd be nothing to hand on, just as there was nothing to hand on when we started in the early 70s. We had to start from scratch and make all our mistakes. So hopefully, we are in at least one stage better than we were then for the next time around. And that's why it's important to keep on going.
Yeah, I'd agree with that last bit. I'm a bit disappointed in you all not letting me expropriate all the churches. I'm quite looking forward to that. But yes, I take your point. The repression of religion is not the way to go. Yeah, I was not saying that trying to say that you should stop people believing in gods and so forth. You can't do that, obviously, but I was thinking, let's get hold of the churches and turn them into something useful, but fair enough if that's what you want.
You can have the Historic Churches. The Historic Churches Commission will give you half the churches in England now.
Right. Well, okay, that's a start. That'll be all right. I'll be happy with that.
Well, half of them are shut, and they're run by this organisation.
Yeah, okay. I'm a little bit buoyed off by this.
They're a bugger to heat.
Have tried for quite a while.
Can I go on a bit about the partly what Helen was saying, and I think there is a bit of more of a discussion there. I'm concerned that yes, I agree with what Helen was saying, that don't think that democracy, the democratic system, is such a kind and gentle thing and it's going to roll over when there's a revolution coming on. I was simply trying. But on the other hand, what I don't think you can do, Helen, is just when we were talking about religions and what you can't do for religions, then you can't treat Islam the same as the Church of England or the Quakers or something like that. Yes, American. There are other religions. It's not just Islam, but the American evangelists and so forth aim to take a really strong and violent grip on, a hands-on grip on the society that they control. They won't be the passive element, they will be the element that you're fighting against. So you also have to be careful about saying, we must give religion this room to express itself, we can't repress them, when I think Islam, and those bits, the different factions of Islam, the evangelists in America perhaps, will be the actual body that you're fighting. They will be the state body in that region. Is that fair? Yeah. Okay.
My point was basically linked to that. The idea that Islam will oppose the religion is a massive generalisation. I mean, when you're talking about Islam, like you say, there's so many different branches. So the best aspects of Islam will join the revolution. The rest of it will be, like you say, will be fighting against it.
Yeah.
I think that's the same with Christianity. It's the same with all religions. Yes, Islam has more, from its inception, has more of a commitment to political, taking of political power, and the split between religion and politics doesn't really exist to the same extent.
It is the power, it is the state capitalist force.
To an extent. I mean, historically there's been different times, different, but that is true. But I mean, in one sense, like I say, I think that can just as much be part of what is good about Islam. That historically it's been determined to take a role in politics and so on, and has played. Well, I mean, the first movement of Muhammad played a revolutionary role that allowed for massive progression. But also, it will mean that there will be groups in Islam that will join the revolution, that will see it as their movement. There isn't the working class and then Islam. There's Muslim workers, and part of what is good in Islam and I think in Judaism as opposed to Christianity historically has been the fact that there is a tradition of debate, there's a tradition of engagement with the world. I'm not saying it's taken on a positive role most of the time, but I would say that basically that idea that Islam will be against the revolution is not quite accurate.
So can I ask a question about that? Because fine, but does that mean there are already elements within Islam, sectors, sections, whatever we're going to, factions, that are antagonistic to the state, or more communist in character, more what we call left inclining, but it's not. That's not what Islam is. But you know, do you see what I mean? Does it mean there is a reactionary core and then these revolting elements, shall we say, antagonistic to it?
I don't have massive, but spoke to.
I've asked that before and I've got no answer.
Mm.
I said no. So,
I mean, Muslim individuals I spoke to, a lot of them seem open to the ideas
Yeah.
of communism and so on. I went on a Sufi retreat for a little while, and a lot of the people there were open to the idea of revolution, were open to the idea of communism. One of them told me to read more. What was it? I can't remember the philosopher. I got into a whole discussion about philosophy with him. He told Heidegger, yeah, but it's not to do with communism.
Wasn't he a pro-Nazi?
But yeah, I think that basically when you talk about Islam, it's such a massive, how many billion people, and there are traditions in it that are socialistic. There are traditions in it which will be open to revolution, I would say, and historically have been.
Tradition. Sorry, do you mind me just asking for more? What you mean? A little bit more detail about the
Okay,
traditions that are socialistic. It's a lovely expression. I mean, is there more that you can say about that? Because I don't know. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I mean, sort of going with that, I mean, you could say that about sort of Christianity as well. There are sort of, sort of John Paul and that kind of. But I mean, the fact that that you have these kind of utopian ideas within sort of religion, I'm not sure that it has any sort of resonance in terms of how sort of organised religion is going to react in the face of workers' revolution, which in my view is going to be almost wholly reactionary.
Well, the organised part of it, maybe, or the parts of it that have an alliance with the status quo, obviously they will oppose the revolution. But I'm saying there are elements, not just among the general population, obviously, but also in terms of when we talk about Islam. One of the things that Islam managed to avoid was to have priests, for example, and I think that has meant that historically there's been a degree of independence amongst, and like to be an imam is not a profession. It's not in general anyway. It's not a profession. It's like a rabbi, for example, originally wasn't a profession. It was just a respected person in the community. So,
Does imam mean teacher?
Yeah. And so, in that way, I think there will be religious people, even respected religious leaders, if you wanted to, that might side with the revolution if it comes. The point is obviously class basis, and there will be those who feel themselves threatened will side with the counter-revolution. Those who are open to the revolution will side with it. I'm not sure. Basically, I'm just criticising the idea that Islam will be against revolution. Just you can't say Christianity will be against religion. There will be Christian sects. There will be Christian groups that will side with the revolution. In all parts of the world. So, that's my main point.
I mean, every year I was teaching at a sixth form college, and still doing it even though I'm retired. I give a talk on Marxism to the politics class, and then the last few years I've had Nick Heath from the Anarchist Federation to give a talk on anarchism. And I'm sort of fairly used to talking to a lot of young Muslims at the college, and he was absolutely staggered really by the fact that most of the radical talk, if you like, in terms of changing society and agreement with what was being said about the need for getting rid of capitalism and so on, were young Muslims, young girls in hijab especially. He was quite happy about it, but it wasn't something he'd really encountered before. And I think a lot of reaction was I think communism is a very good thing, but why do you have to be against religion? So then you have to go into a deeper discussion. But obviously, there will be in a revolution people who see the point of communism before they see the point of religion. they won't see the contradiction may become clearer to them later on, but they may begin with the idea that there's nothing contradictory with fighting for a society that is against, a communist society, and still having religious studies. And I think it's right that there will be a split. There will be all sorts of schisms and splits and so on taking place, which will tend towards the disintegration of organised religion, and some will still express it in a religious way. I mean, when I'm talking about a political united front, we're talking about going into, the social movement has all sorts of contradictory elements within it, and you're trying to intervene within it and to appeal to those elements within what they understand as their tradition, which are communists, which are always there in all the religious traditions. So I think there is a reality in that. But I think that as society evolves towards communism, then religions of all types will disappear, because as you say, that religion is a product of alienated human relations. This is a point that I disagree with Nick's interpretation. I don't think religion is fundamentally a product of people not understanding how nature works. I think that's a rationalist explanation of religion. It doesn't really correspond to Marx's real insight into religion, which is a product of alienation between man and nature. That's why it has a material basis. It isn't just an intellectual mistake, which is the basis of all sort of Richard Dawkins type of argument. Religious people are stupid because they don't understand how the world works. And that is at the root of the whole sort of Enlightenment view of religion, that it's just a mistaken view of reality. But it's actually a reflection of, as Marx said, it is a product of a condition which requires illusion. In other words, it's a product of alienation between human beings and between human beings and nature. And until you've overcome that, which is a long process in the future, really overcome it, then you will have vestiges of religious thinking. And Marx talked about common sense as the religion of everyday life. Everyday bourgeois common sense. He called that a religion. So, I mean, there's something to think about there.
You're saying.
I think Trotsky also talks about the theological metaphysics of natural rights as well. So.
Okay, well, are there any more points that you want to raise? I'll just come back on the last point. What I was trying to emphasise, well, there are two things really that I was trying to emphasise about religion, which is firstly that when Marx says, I think this is what you're saying actually, he says that religion can only vanish when relations between human beings in their practical everyday life have assumed the aspect of perfectly intelligible, reasonable relations. So it isn't just, that relations are mystified within capitalism. They're opaque. They're not. It's really not clear. And in the first chapter, this is from the first chapter of Capital, and he points out how the relations under capitalism are basically inhuman relationships. You've got the relationship between people is material relationship, and the relationship between commodities appears as a social relationship. So things are just inverted under capitalism, and it's very difficult to penetrate what's really going on. And this
this leads into religion. This results in alienation, of course, from Marx's early work. He'd call it alienation, but because of this opaqueness of human relations with each other, between human and human relations with nature, this gives a space for religious interpretation of the world. And under communism, the relationships will become clear between people. So the space for religion will narrow. That's what I was trying to say. I know you're a student of religion, aren't you? You may have gone into it in more detail than that, but that's all I was trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's a body. It's not just an intellectual process. It involves the body, if you like, the emotions. It's in that sense, it has a material root within the individual as well as within in relations between individuals. It's a mistake to see it simply as a question of an intellectual error, which was very much the view of the sort of Enlightenment thinkers, and therefore it can be overcome simply through education. Prove that everybody's got the religious idea's got the wrong idea.
But it is an intellectual error, nonetheless.
It is.
It is correct.
It has an intellectual dimension, but it can't be reduced to that, is what I'm saying.
It's not going to be penetrated with the present society we have. So shouldn't be surprised to see there's a persistence of religious ideology, and the religious ideology is increasing with the problems of capitalism. The more barbaric it gets, the more people seem to be happy to turn to religion.
But you could say that about nationalism. You know, in fact, the people on both sides of these kind of divides, which have material roots, are talking up either the religion or the national interest. You know, as in the Ukraine or in Syria, whatever. And it's the same. And it's the actions that they carry out. You know, the atrocities that are carried out by the pro-Russian Ukrainians against Ukrainians, and the appalling reciprocal action of the Ukrainian central government. They create the divisions that these people want. I mean, you're not telling me that most people in the east of Ukraine want separation from the Ukraine. Most of them want a quiet life and a sustainable existence. Increasingly, that's not happened. But these gangsters on both sides, you know, whoever was in the Maidan, whoever is in these militias, they have a vested interest in creating all kinds of atrocities. And I mean, I think IS's atrocities are extremely rational. You know, chopping off the heads of Westerners on TV, picking on tribes that have gone up against them when they've promised to support them, and doing the Genghis Khan thing. You either obey or we massacre you, and then the final looting of these fantastic monuments in northern Iraq. You know, they're all targeted terror tactics or tactics that show, you know, we are creating something, and it's of course, and all the time they're putting, as you said in the talk, it's a response to the carnage that Western imperialism has inflicted on the Middle East and Central Asia for the last 4 decades or whatever. So, you know, none of this is it's no surprise that we're getting more and more of the mystification, but they are the mystifications of people who it's like, you know, like the IRA and the UDF, you know, deliberately carrying out atrocities against the other side, usually innocent people on the other side, in order to make sure that the conflict kept on going, and that they then embed themselves into whatever situation they want to embed themselves in. And I think it's the same here. I like I now know how to tackle that arrogant fellow, the atheist chappie. Which Dawkins? I've always thought he doesn't understand human beings, this guy. And now you've explained it to me, so I don't know.
I'd like to come back to this point about relations not being clear and relate that back to how can we have any effect on this situation. Seems to me there's two pretty fundamental things that we need to do, which is understand what is the period that we're in and understand what our role is as revolutionaries in it. So with those in mind, how do we bring some clarity into this situation? How do we attempt to pull the mystificatory veils away, whether they're nationalism, religion, how people are being suckered into false alternatives. If they think that capitalist society is decadent and terrible, what they should really be doing is attempting to organise against capitalism, not going and joining a militia that actually supports just a slightly different brand of capitalism. How is it that we can have any real effect on any part of this situation?
And the answer?
Reinforce the existing communist organisations was my last answer to you, and it's my next as well.
I think it's supposed to say, I refer the honourable gentleman to the answer that I gave earlier.
Okay, well, I'm not sure if we've reached any conclusions, but I think we've certainly sort of had a fairly interesting discussion around the sort of issues of imperialism in the Middle East and the sort of addressing the question of religion. So I don't know if you want to sum up that.
We've got the room for a bit longer, haven't we?
We have, yeah.
Sort of discussion is sort of petered out in a way, because I suppose we don't, I mean, it's an admission really that we don't have any solutions, or we don't have very much to offer, and you know, we're sort of looking at the situation and expressing, you know, well, not quite despair, but we're really appalled by what's going on, and it seems like there's very little progressive forces in it. One thing I did mention in the talk, of course, which sort of hasn't come back in the discussion at all, was the role of the working class in Egypt and in Tunisia, where particularly in Egypt, where the working class suddenly came into the struggle, and within a week Mubarak was gone, which is quite positive, I think, for us, that we can see the weight of the working class. What's happened since? There have been massive struggles in some of the Delta cities, where particularly the cotton factories and so on. But basically, bourgeoisie's got control of the situation again, and we now have a military dictatorship under Sisi, with people being shot down in the streets, but being sentenced to death by the bloody hundreds, aren't they? So on the positive side, we're seeing that there is a strength. There is a working class there. There's a strength to this class, but it isn't able to direct this strength in a way which has prevented wars and massacres and so on throughout the Middle East. So that's the situation. Obviously, isn't completely hopeless, and there's positive elements in it. And we've seen elements in Turkey opposing the movement of Kobani and so on. But to try and sum up the discussion.
So is it possible to extend things a bit?
Yes, it is.
Sorry, I missed some part of what you were saying.
Yeah,
I think
sort
it's
of
true that we
introduced
haven't
another
really
element now. I mean, but we have got
room till 5, so
we've got the room till 5, but I mean, it just seemed like the discussion was petering out. But
well, I think that the question of the Arab Spring is pretty important, and the situation of the working class struggle globally is important. So it'd be worth. I'm sorry, I missed part of what you said, but I think one of the most important things about the Arab Spring was not what happened. I mean, clearly it did show, particularly what happened in Tunisia and Egypt, showed momentarily the power of the working class and its capacity to influence a sort of wider social movement. But when the working class is absent, as it was largely in Syria and Libya and all the other places where the Arab Spring spread to, then the impact was very quickly seen. The transformation of what in some cases began as a sort of social protest into a military sort of slaughter was almost immediate, which didn't happen in Egypt straight away, although even in Egypt things have clearly regressed and so on. But probably the most important impact that the Arab Spring had was the fact that it began to have a spread to Europe. And the movement in Spain, I think, in 2011 was probably the most important movement of the last 10 years, certainly since the movement in France in 2006, because it posed certain key questions about how the new generations of workers who don't have of proletarians who don't have a very strong sense of themselves as being part of the working class can begin to pose questions about the nature of the society. And that too obviously came up against fundamental limitations. But that was the most important demonstration, if you like, that the future still remains in the centres of world capitalism, because that's where the working class, despite all the changes in its composition and so on taking place in the last few decades, and despite the gradual sort of decline in the sense of class identity that we've seen, and despite, as was said, the continuing weight of this whole ideology about defeat of communism, it's still in the centres of world capitalism, and particularly in Western Europe, where the key to overturning the current extremely difficult situation still resides. I think that we've seen in the last, well, say from 2003 to 2013, there were what you might call a cycle of struggles and so on that went around the world. I think that's finished now, and I think that's one of the reasons why we're facing such a difficult situation. But the situation is not just over the last couple of years; it goes back much further than that. And I think that the impact that that's having on the politicised minority is also quite profound. Point that I made before. So that the process of building a political movement in opposition to capitalism has proved extremely difficult, much harder than any of us thought when we first started out, and I think we still haven't really got to all the roots of why this is so difficult, and why it's continually coming up against obstacles, and you appear to make some progress and then things start to regress again. I certainly the ICC has experienced that, but I don't think we're alone in that. I think it's a product of a much deeper situation. But I think this is linked to the profound difficulty of the working class taking a step forward. I think it remains the case that possibility is much stronger in the centres in the traditional centres of world capitalism than in the rest of the world. I think that what's happening in the Middle East now is a tragic demonstration of what happens when the working class doesn't assert itself against capitalism.
Much could agree with here, but I think we need to put this in a longer term context. In Britain, the communist left as it exists, which is mainly the World Revolution and the CWO, is a product of the end of the post-war boom and all the resistance to it, not just in Britain but internationally. But we were very much involved in what was going on in the period 72 to 76 or 77, and there was an expectation that this was going to lead to some new political movement, some new alignment. In fact, what we were looking at was workers resisting the cuts in their living standards on a form of what our Liverpool comrades used to call money militancy. It didn't generate, apart from in odd little bits and pieces, the kind of class consciousness that we thought would mechanically, because I think we all thought mechanically at the time, would stem from it. And since then, the working class has been in retreat. From 77, when the Labour government put in the first cuts in the national health, which everybody forgets, but was the year the IMF said that Britain had too big a set of debts, which were about, nowadays would buy you a packet of crisps, the debts that we had then. That from that period on, the working class has been in a gradual, steady retreat, and that's why we altered our perspectives. In fact, our perspectives went the other way. We had people that we had to fight against and argue against who thought that World War III was round the corner in the early 80s, and we had to overcome that one internally. But as it happened, we also said, like, the miners' strike is critical. At this point, either they win or we win. And we didn't think it was just a corporatist struggle. We thought that it was very keen for us to understand the whole of where the class movement was going to go, and not just in Britain, because in Europe they were watching. Everybody was watching Britain. And if in the summer of 1984, the dock workers and the miners, and in fact all the people we were trying to get to work together, had struck together, it would have been a totally different thing. Whether it would have gone beyond corporatism is another question, because the NUM was a very strange union. It's a very rank and file union, but the rank and file are more corporatist than the bureaucrats. So a lot of our interventions in that we found very hard, because we were dealing with rank and file people who didn't see that they had to go beyond their own struggle. However, that was followed by Wapping. That was followed by, I can't remember what the other one was, but by the end of the 80s, but even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was clear that the working class was in a position of being restructured. We'd had mass unemployment in the early 1980s, which had destroyed the heart of militancy that we'd been used to when we started. And then we've been gradually in retreat. The Soviet Union collapsing just added that little ideological view that communism was a flawed and failed ideology because Stalinism being identified with communism, and that meant that they were able to go ahead with the globalization, financialization, and concentration of capital. And I think that's why what Alf said is correct, that it's more important today that the centres of world capitalism are attacked than ever before, because here the financial levers, even all the workers in China, you'd think would be something you could focus on, but the financial levers of the world and all the power, all the investment that goes into these places around the world is all to be found in the European, Japanese, and G7 imperialist powers, and it's here that obviously a significant movement will be required. It may not start there. The Arab Spring sparked off Spain. You said, well, anything can spark off anything, and we could yet see one day another 1848 or a 1917 to 21. 1848 is the example. In the age of the telegraph, there was no chance of communications like today. But what did we get? We got 15 capital cities were in revolt within less than a month, just by using the newly invented telegraph. And again, with the social media and all the rest of it, there is no reason to say that the working class could not, in some form, start the same kind of revolutionary movement that has the same kind of impact going around the world. We've had the no-globals, we've had the anti-capitalists, we've had the indignados. They've all, as you've said, retreated. But of course, they do leave a little ripple, as they do retreat. And if the working class is still faced with the same kind of... the trouble is that with capitalism, its contradictions never go away. Austerity is not going to go away. And at some point, at a time when we have just about all given up, something will be triggered off by some event somewhere. And that will be the sign for any kind of change.
Sorry, is that those of us of the older generation may not live to see the revolution?
Sorry?
Are you saying those of us of the older generation may not live to see the revolution?
I've always said that.
A month before.
I said that to the comrades of the ICC in 1974. That we would not see revolution in our lifetime. Sorry?
But the point is the Tsar's supposed to be toppled a month later.
I didn't get your point.
I can't remember what it was. Oh, yeah, sorry. Can I just make one quick mention? Turkey was mentioned, and the comrades in, the internationalists in Turkey, nobody's particularly mentioned which comrades in Turkey they are, but we all know that there are some comrades in Turkey at least. Israel, nobody's mentioned Israel in the course of our discussions though.
I did.
What's happening in the Middle East?
I said Israel and Saudi were the cornerstones of it.
What role is the Israeli working class? What role can the Israeli working class have in this? How? Because it seems to me obvious that without the Israeli working class coming to an understanding of the role of the Israeli state, then things can't get any better. But how? I mean, it seems to me that Israel is a state where the working class is particularly mystified as to the situation, where the Israeli state finds it seemingly really easy to enroll the Israeli working class behind its national banners, and somehow, as I say, where the mystifications of capitalism and nationalism and religion and the whole shitstorm of ideological confusion that capitalism relies on is piled up to the nth degree. And I wonder if anybody's got any insight, suggestion as to how that situation might change.
I mean, true what you say, and there is a very widespread idea, which is mainly among leftists, but I've seen it expressed by anarchists and others, that Israeli working class isn't really working class at all. You know, they're not. They're like a colonial entity or something. That's a very widespread idea. I think the situation is very, very difficult. But again, in 2011, another very important moment in the so-called Arab Spring was the fact that it broke out in Israel, and there was a very important movement around a social question, not around the question of housing, which affects everyone, affects immigrants from Ethiopia, Jews, Arabs, and so on, and that was begun to be recognised in the demonstrations and the protests, which also raised the slogan that Assad, Netanyahu, and Mubarak are all the same. That was a breakthrough. I mean, and now it seems to be completely reversed. The last war, we were told everyone was supporting the war and so on, even though at the time of 2011 people were saying, I bet people in the movement were saying one of the things they'll do now will probably spark off another war in order to win back national unity, which they didn't do at the time, but after the last war there was certainly a revival of national unity. So it seems like everything that was gained at that moment has been lost. I don't think it has been lost. I think these, as you said, these movements leave a remnant, just as the Indignados movement has left a small, tiny remnant for our comrades in Spain. There's tiny groups of people who come out of that movement and who are very, very serious and discussing politics at a higher level, I would say, than some of the contacts that came forward in the previous period. These are very, very almost invisible products of a movement. And in Israel it's particularly difficult. But I don't think that all that has taken place in the last decades and even further back has been definitively lost. I think it still remains, and it's kind of buried, but I don't think it's lost, and it's that which gives you the possibility of thinking there can be future revolts and so on. But I think I agree overall that the expectations of the revolutionary movements in the early 70s, perhaps the ICC more than anywhere else, were we didn't make sufficient critique of the economism and the purely defensive struggle of the working class, and the necessity of politicisation. Why is it so difficult for the working class to politicise its struggle, to take its struggle onto a wider level than just the economic defence? And that's one of the reasons why, despite all the, I don't agree that there's been a complete retreat since the 70s, because there have been some very, very important struggles, not only in Britain but internationally, certainly up until the end of the 80s. It was for us, very, very important struggle. But very rarely did they go beyond this level of economic defence, and that's the difficulty of politicisation. Is also a product of. It also gives rise to the difficulties of the political milieu to develop, because if the working class isn't politicising itself in its struggles, then it's much harder for a political movement to develop. And I think, the popularity, if you look at the political movement today in Britain, one of the currents which has been most successful on a very temporary basis is the anarcho-syndicalists, who've retreated into a sort of economistic, what we've got to do is build up little groups at the workplace. Workplace organising, they call it. And I think this is an expression of on the one hand, it's an attempt to overcome some of the prejudiced anarchist ideas about lifestyleism and individualism, and the idea that the working class has got something to do with it. but it's a very, very narrow economist vision of the working class, which I think is to some extent an expression of the wider difficulties in the working class to go beyond economism.
So what's our role as revolutionaries in trying to help the working class get some clarity as to where it goes?
Well, certainly not to capitulate to economism. We have to show that the fundamental role of the revolutionaries is at the political level. It's the level of showing the broader nature of the struggle. I mean, obviously that can be a banality, but I think it's something that it's easy for revolutionaries at the same time to fall back into the Islamic economistic views of the struggle, sort of purely activist ideas about what we can do, and the idea of a kind of incrementally building up. And obviously it's a disagreement we've had with the ICT over the years, with the idea that you could somehow build up these instruments at the economic level, and that would sort of accumulate at some point and become something political, would somehow politicise it. That was the answer to politicising the struggle. And I think that it's necessary to examine that whole way of looking at things as well. I think the revolutionaries faced with a lot of re-examination of what they've been doing for the last. I'm not saying that they have to reject what they've been doing the last 40 years, but it's a time when I think it's very important to look at the reasons behind our own difficulties and so on, and to see to what extent this was rooted in errors that we've carried with us for many years.
Yeah, I think the ultimate reasons behind all our difficulties is the lack of class struggle, basically. That must be right, but I think without a doubt what we need to do is to build up our forces one way or another, and I still don't see what I don't see that the strategy which the ICT has is incorrect, of trying to form area groups and workplace groups which have a political and economic function, and trying to draw people into the party and into the political organisation in that way. I'm not sure if that's what you were actually criticising, Alan, but I still think that's a correct strategy, and I don't see another strategy coming up. I mean, we can hold public meetings and we can leaflet and things, and we were, for example, we were asked to hold this meeting by one of our contacts rather in Oxford, but she hasn't turned up, and one of the other people who said they wanted to come, one of your anarcho-syndicalists, and people from the AAF, and we got a lot of people sort of hovering around the organisation, but we're not drawing them into the organisation through the things we're doing sufficiently, incremental and glacial in its sort of progress. But does that mean our strategy is wrong for attempting to engage in struggle and form workplace groups and things? I don't think so, and I think it has been validated in what we have managed to achieve in Italy. I still think that is a strategy we have which hasn't been discredited really. All we're seeing is a collapse in class struggle, which we're all suffering from.
Any further contributions on this?
I think after 40 years, you have to ask yourself, has this strategy worked? I think it's time to look at yourselves, just as I think we are looking at ourselves.
Can you propose
what have we made? Well, first of all, if the strategy is wrong, then we have to first of all decide on that. I mean, I think there are some. I don't think we've got time to go into all the details of this, or the depth of it, if you like. But I think there are misconceptions behind it, the theoretical misconceptions, which need to be examined. I mean, reflected in what you just said about drawing people to the party. There is no party to draw people to, and that's a sort of slip of the tongue, if you like, that expresses, I think, a deep misconception that goes right back to the origins of the current that we come from. And I think sometimes the ITC has fallen into similar ideas, that we are a mini party, that we're a little party, and that we can grow by being a party, and we'll grow into the party by being a party. And the question is whether that's been successful or not. I think the situation we're in now shows it hasn't been.
But the question is, I mean, what's the alternative? If our strategy is wrong, then what strategy would be right? I think there is a sort of genuine sort of dilemma. I mean, that there's an issue with the class not being in struggle, but if class struggle was to suddenly develop rapidly tomorrow, we wouldn't be in a position to influence it because we're too small. So we would have struggle, but we would not necessarily grow. They do. To a small degree, but not exponentially. So it's almost like a vicious circle, I think. I don't have any sort of solution to it, really. Helen, please.
We see ourselves as the inheritors of the tradition of the communist left, and particularly the Italian left. And one thing the Italian left did in the 1930s, now I know we're not in the same situation, but one thing that they did there was to completely examine set themselves the task of examining without ostracism what had led to the defeat of the revolutionary way. Now, we're not in a situation of just having undergone a defeat. We're not in the same situation, but we are in a situation where we have to try and understand what has happened, what are the obstacles, what is the difficulty, what is the reason for the difficulty of the working class to develop its struggle, to develop its consciousness, even to develop an understanding that it is a working class with not in the sort of Stalinist trade union sense, but as a historic class with a perspective. We also have to try and understand where are we, so that the question that's raised, how else can we go about it? The question that's raised that if there was a huge upsurge of struggle today, we wouldn't have the forces to make a response on the level needed, which is perfectly true. But we need to take a step back and to try and understand things at the deeper level.
I don't know what it was precisely you think we should try to understand now, but I think that the strategy that anybody's had in the context of the last 40 years would be a failure. But what at least we've got, and it's only in Italy, is that we've got a strategy for how do we relate to the working class in struggle. Over the years, Battaglia have had factory groups in God knows how many factories, but they have had very particular problems. Obviously, victimisation is one, by both the union and the bosses. So a lot of people have been laid off, sacked, and all sorts. So your group then, which obviously depends usually on one person with a group of interested workers around them, collapses. And then another one springs up in another factory. But it's like with everything else, at least in these factories, there are still people that they know, people that there's a possibility to contact. In Pomigliano, in International Harvesters Titan Works in Bologna, in Fiat Mirafiore, there is a group. There's in the one in Fiat Mirafiore, the last time they had a meeting, they had 12 people to it. So they may not be the most successful things in the world, but the idea is that they at least keep us in some kind of contact with the wider working class. And this has also led to changes in our reflections, because as the working class composition has changed, it started off, we talked about factory groups, then we realised that factories were a declining feature of Western life, so we called them workplace groups and moved into things like the bureaucracies and looked at that. And then of course we realised that the real struggle wasn't just in the factory, but also in the housing, in the local communities, about evictions and all the rest of it. And so we started then talking about, well, they talk about area groups. We talk, about community groups, and we in Faction Sheffield did form something like that, which was the No War But Class War, which could have been something that would have happened all over the country. It wasn't. We only joined it, right? We didn't form it, but spontaneously we created a struggle group which had a clear political agenda, but not controlled by us, or not. In fact, it collapsed when the anarchists fell out with each other and went away, and then gradually it was only left with, we were running it, and as soon as we started running it, we knew we were in trouble, because it meant that it was becoming our group instead of being a broader group. But these are practical things we're doing. I mean, when you talk about the anarcho-syndicalists being successful at the moment, they're being successful because they've identified the weakness in the state's system, and that is that there's a certain degree of casual workers that don't come under, that can't be taken in by the existing unions, and so they've moved into that sphere. The cleaners, the fast food workers, and they're doing it in the northeast as well. And in fact, we've had a discussion with them. But of course, we're also finding that some people from the IWW are writing to us and saying, we want to know more about your organisation, because this lot are all being economistic, and they're being opportunistic, and there's no politics in this lot anymore. So I think we have to have a strategy to widen the base. But if we don't have that strategy that's got political framework as well, then it ends up like the anarcho-syndicalists. And I think when you consider the situation when we started off, and the situation that we've had, and as Nick said, we can't invent the class struggle. We are a product of it, and our weakness is a product of the perceptible weakness of the class struggle that exists now. But since the subprime crisis went, the system is no longer as accepted. And one thing that I get in agreement with what Al said is that the legacy of these struggles that came after the Arab Spring is that now we can talk about anti-capitalism. Now we can go along and say, oh, we're Marxists, and people don't say either get back to Russia or, you know, you're from the planet Mars. You know, we now have the language of the debate has changed. Now it's just, all right, it's in the terms of just the debate, but at least it gives us more hearing and more being listened to. I'm on a bloody, what do they call that thing, Facebook thing, where there's called the Teesside Solidarity Movement. It's got 700 people on it, right? I mean, God knows where they come from, because there's only 30 people ever go to the meetings in Middlesbrough, right? Which are dreadful, right? There's a trade union faction, and then there's a wishy-washy, anarchisty, but increasingly listen to left communisty faction at the other side, and we're just putting stuff into it, and we are getting people responding to us, and we're getting now these people coming back to us and asking us, what would you do in this situation? They all say it's bollocks when we tell them, but at least we've got a debate going on. Yes. And that is, I think, what, you know, we have to get out of our left communist ghetto. We're not going to solve things in rooms like this. Although sometimes I think we need more engaged discussions, but that's another issue. But certainly, getting out and into the wider world is the only way we're going to make anything.
Just one thing which could be mentioned is that the crisis isn't going away. I mean, this is underlying everything which we've been talking about. And I think the bourgeoisie is becoming more conscious of it as well. And I don't know if any of you have tried to read this book by Piketty, Thomas Piketty, which has been so famous over the last year. But one of the things he is saying is that the issue of inequality, which, you know, he's produced all these tables which analyse it over the last 2 centuries. But what he's basically saying is that the system has reverted back to the old normal, back to what it was in the 19th century, with the richest 10% owning more and more of the wealth and getting larger and larger amount of the national income throughout all the older capitalist countries. But what he's basically saying is this is unsustainable, and it's going to lead to what he calls expropriation of the richest people by the poorest 50%. That obviously he's a bourgeois academic who doesn't support expropriation, or he tries to think of ways to prevent this, doesn't he? And then, you know, I mean, proposes a tax, for example, on wealth, and a very high marginal rate of income tax, and then he says he doesn't think it'll work anyway because capitalism will become global and the top 10% control all these things, and they'll never legislate to remove their property. So, I only mention this to point out that, you know, even elements of the bourgeoisie are becoming concerned about the way the system is working. So, in the long term, there's material forces working in our favour, although we've painted quite a bleak situation this afternoon. But just to sum up the situation, I mean, we started off with the question of what's the future in the Middle East, the future, and basically that's it. question about imperialism and what we expect to happen. And I think there was sort of a reasonable discussion on this and a general agreement that what we're going to see is more of the same, sort of more widespread barbaric war in the Middle East and more failed states before there's any improvement. And the second element of the discussion was on religion, which unfortunately went on a bit too long, I thought. But I think we eventually did come to some sort of agreement about this, that the fact that religion will persist as long as capitalism persists. It is.
It lasts longer.
It will last longer. The discussion also did bring up all the divisions which intellectual divisions which are being created in the Middle East and worldwide by the religious forces which are coming to the fore, which is certainly it leads to the question of what contribution we can make. And I think the discussion concluded with a fairly limited contribution we can make in the Middle East. The only contribution we can make is here in the metropolitan heartlands through strengthening our intervention in the struggles and strengthening our organisations as well, which leads to the question of how we can do this, which really leads to the sort of probably the most important part of the discussion this afternoon, which is about the sort of strategies we've got for strengthening ourselves, which the ICC derides us for having a strategy which has not worked over 40 years. But that doesn't actually prove the strategy is wrong, because it hasn't worked in a context of retreating class struggle and present a very low level of class struggle, and changing composition of the working class as well. And the final thought, which I think is worth bearing in mind as we sort of come to the end, is that the actual changes material changes in the composition of the class are producing a more global class than ever before in history, and producing a larger working class than ever before in history. It just isn't concentrated any longer in the metropolitan countries. It's worldwide, with massive concentrations of workers in Asia and in South America and also in Africa, who are engaging in struggles, but struggles which are not overtly political, but they're struggles against capital nonetheless. And we're seeing things like capital's response in the massacre at Marikana in South Africa, which are an indication, I think, of the sharpening